Welcome to the historical mind. When you think of a medieval executioner, you probably think of one thing, chopping off heads. But what if I told you that was only a tiny, and often rare, part of his job description? Today we uncover the real, gritty, and surprisingly diverse life of a medieval executioner, from torturer and tax collector to animal control and sanitation expert. His duties were far stranger and more disgusting than you can imagine. This is the real life of the man who handled society's dirty work. The executioner's shadow, the real life of a medieval executioner in the grand and brutal theatre of medieval justice. No figure was more central, more necessary, or more universally feared than the executioner. Folklore paints him as a hulking, anonymous brute in a black hood, a silent spectre of death defined by a single, gruesome act. But the reality of his life was a strange, isolating, and often miserable paradox. He was a vital state employee and a reviled social outcast, a master of a grim and demanding craft and a collector of society's most abject filth, a man who dealt in death but was often also a sought-after healer. To understand the real life of a medieval executioner is to look into the dark, contradictory heart of the society. He served a society that desperately needed his services, but condemned him for providing them. Master of more than just the axe, while the climactic swing of the sword or axe upon the scaffold was the most visible part of his job, it was often the least common. Public executions, though spectacular and well attended, were not an everyday occurrence in most towns. The executioner's true role was far broader. He was, in fact, a master of a whole spectrum of state-sanctioned violence and public unpleasantness, the living embodiment of the law's physical power. His primary day-to-day role was to be the physical arm of the law, administering a wide array of non-lethal but brutal public punishments designed for humiliation and deterrence. If a criminal was sentenced to be flogged in the town square, it was the executioner who wielded the whip, his skill measured in delivering the precise number of lashes without killing the victim, leaving them as a scarred and living warning to others. If the punishment was branding with a red-hot iron to permanently mark a thief, the amputation of a hand, or the slitting of a nose or ears to disfigure a perjurer, he was the man for the job, performing his work with a steady, practiced hand amidst the jeers of the crowd. Furthermore, the executioner was the state's official torturer. When the court required a confession, often a prerequisite for a conviction, the accused would be handed over to him in the dark, terrifying, and often soundproofed chambers beneath the courthouse. He would employ the rack, the thumbscrews, the strappado, and other instruments of agony. This was not random brutality. It required a practiced, dispassionate skill. His knowledge of the human body's limits was unparalleled, honed by the grim necessity of inflicting maximum pain, to break a person's will without prematurely killing the subject and rendering their confession invalid. Because these official duties were still not enough to make a living, the executioner's role expanded into a strange and grim economy. He was often entitled to the clothes of his victims and could sell the rope from a hanging as a good luck talisman. He was also tasked with society's most reviled jobs, reinforcing his status as a handler of all things unclean. He was frequently the town knacker, responsible for the disposal of the carcasses of dead or diseased animals of foul-smelling and disease-ridden task. He might also be in charge of cleaning the town's latrines and cesspits, making him a part-time gone farmer, submerged in the filth of the very citizens who shunned him. In some regions, he was even given the authority to collect taxes from lepers and prostitutes, or to oversee the local brothel, forcing him to interact with other marginalized groups. He was, in essence, the city's designated manager of all things. The honorable public wished to discard, both moral and physical, a life of social exile. Despite his essential civic function, the executioner was a pariah. The man who upheld the law was considered tainted by death, blood, and violence. In a deeply superstitious society, he was seen as a figure of profound bad luck and spiritual contamination. This wasn't just a social stigma. It was a legally and socially enforced isolation that defined every aspect of his existence. Executioners were often forced by law to live outside the town walls or in the most undesirable quarter, near the gallows, the cemetery, or the foul-smelling tanneries. When they entered a crowded market, a bubble of fear would form around them as people scrambled to avoid accidental contact. A mother would pull her child away. A merchant might refuse to touch the executioner's coin directly, insisting it be placed on the counter. To touch an executioner was to invite misfortune, sickness, or even damnation, a bitter irony for the man whose services were so publicly demanded on execution day. In some places, they had to wear specific clothing often, a particular color like a shameful red or green, or carry a special staff to announce their presence and allow others to keep their distance. They ate alone in taverns and were often forbidden from entering churches through the main door, forced to listen to Mass from a separate, unclean entrance if they were allowed in at all. This ostracism was a heavy cloak that extended to his entire family. No respectable family would willingly marry an executioner's daughter. No master craftsman would take his son as an apprentice. This social prison forced the profession to become hereditary. Executioners formed their own strange, isolated dynasties, marrying their children to the children of other executioners from neighboring towns, creating a closed network of families bound by their shared, dishonorable trade. The job was not a choice. It was an inheritance, a grim destiny passed from father to son for generations, a stain that could not be washed away. The tools and the terrible skilled popular image of a clumsy, masked brute is largely a myth created to distance the executioner from the rest of humanity. In reality, a successful executioner was a highly skilled professional, for whom incompetence could be fatal. A crowd that witnessed a clumsy, multi-stroke beheading could easily turn into a riot, and the executioner could be fined, flogged, or even killed by the mob for his failure. A clean death was a mark of professional pride, a public demonstration of mastery in a field where failure was not an option. The tools of the trade were varied, each requiring a different expertise. The axe was common for beheading commoners, but it was a crude instrument requiring immense strength and a steady hand to aim for the small, precise point on the neck that would ensure a clean cut. Far more prestigious was the beheading sword, often a large, two-handed blade without a point, reserved for nobles. Wielding it effectively was an art form, requiring precision, a deep understanding of anatomy, and years of practice to deliver a single, clean cut without the aid of a block. Beyond the blade, he was a master of the rope. He had to be a grim physicist, calculating the right length and drop for a hanging to ensure a quick death by a broken neck, rather than slow, agonizing strangulation which would anger the crowd. He presided over the breaking wheel, perhaps the most horrific of all punishments, where he would systematically shatter the limbs of a criminal strapped to a large wagon wheel with a heavy iron bar, a task requiring a precise knowledge of how to destroy a body while keeping the victim alive. For as long as possible as a public warning, his knowledge was not just of death, but of the precise mechanics of human suffering. The mind of the execution, what was the psychological toll of such a life, spent in the shadow of the gallows and shunned by all. We have a remarkable window into this world through the detailed diary of Meister Franz Schmidt, a 16th century executioner in Nuremberg, Germany. His journal, which meticulously records the 361 executions he performed, reveals a man who was not a monster but a pious, dedicated, and deeply conflicted civil servant who took his grim work with the utmost seriousness. Schmidt saw his role as delivering God's final justice on earth, the last step in a sacred ritual of repentance. He often provided comfort to the condemned in their final moments, urging them to confess and make peace with God. For him, a good death was one where the sinner repented publicly, and the execution was swift and clean, a successful performance. In the theater of horror that reaffirmed social and divine order, he expressed frustration when prisoners were defiant and pride. When they met their end with pious courage, he also practiced medicine as a side profession. As many executioners did, their intimate, albeit violent, knowledge of the human body gave them a unique understanding of anatomy, bones, and healing that surpassed that of many university-trained physicians. People who would cross the street to avoid him would secretly seek him out at his home on the edge of town to set a broken bone or treat a difficult wound. This dual role highlights the central paradox of his existence, a man who could break bodies on the wheel in the morning might be sought out to mend them in the afternoon. Ultimately, Franz Schmidt's greatest ambition was to restore his family's honor and free his children from the dishonorable trade he had been forced into. After a long and distinguished career, he successfully petitioned the emperor and was granted a new honorable status, finally escaping the executioner's shadow. His story reveals that behind the grim facade was often a man wrestling with faith, duty, and the desperate hope for a respectable life in a world that had condemned him for serving it. He was the man society paid to touch death and whom they shunned for the same reason a necessary monster, living forever in the shadow of the gallows he served. So, the executioner was far more than just a headsman. He was a torturer, a healer, a tax collector, and a sanitation worker. It was a life of incredible contradictions. But now I want to ask you, which part of the executioner's life do you find more fascinating? The public spectacle of death on the scaffold, or the private struggle of being a social outcast? Let's start a debate in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel, and make sure you're subscribed to the Historical Mind so you don't miss our next journey into the past.